going to the Tony Awards, I mean, there's no greater feeling than to be at the biggest party for theater and to get the award and to be part of the madness of it all. It's absolutely thrilling. I pinch myself every time because if you had told me 10 years ago that I would win 3 Tony Awards as a co-producer in one night, I would think you would be absolutely nuts.
That was the voice of multiple Tony Award-winning Broadway producer Jonathan Demar. Jonathan was also executive producer of my off-Broadway production of Clowns Like Me, and it is my absolute delight to have him on as the guest of this episode of the Page and Stage podcast. As always, I'm your host, Jason Cannon. Before diving into my conversation with Jonathan, I want to give a big shout out to Alitu. Alitu is the all-in-one online podcasting app that I use to put this show together. Doing the show is one of the wildest and best decisions I've ever made, but it literally would not exist without Alitu. And if you're thinking about maybe starting up a podcast of your own, I cannot recommend Alitu highly enough. See, I'd been thinking about doing a podcast for a few years, but never had the time to figure out all the technical and audio stuff. Alitu does all of it. You just upload your audio and boom, it converts the files, levels the volumes, reduces the background noise, does all the other magical mixing stuff, and even has automatic editing filters for those awkward pauses and those pesky ums and ers. Alitu even includes a free music library and hosting. There are even more bells and whistles, but I want to get on with the episode. So check out the show notes and use the link there to learn more about Alitu and sign up. Now, let me tell you more about my guest, Jonathan Demar. Jonathan is a New York-based Tony-winning producer and performer who has worked on various shows on and off Broadway. This past season alone, Jonathan won Tony Awards for being on the producing teams of Stereophonic, Merrily We Roll Along, and Appropriate. His other credits include Hadestown, also a Tony Award winner, An Enemy of the People, Gutenberg the Musical, The Cottage, which, fun connection, I directed down here in Florida before it went to Broadway, Funny Girl, Be More Chill, Love Letters, The Velocity of Autumn, and the list goes on and on. As an actor, Jonathan's credits include A Christmas Carol on Broadway starring F. Murray Abraham, The Alchemists, Tosca, and A Gilbert and Sullivan Christmas Carol. On TV, Jonathan has appeared on Comedy Central, The Onion News Network, The View, and Eyewitness Kid News. And if that weren't enough, his debut single, The Right Intimacy, is available to stream on all platforms. Here we go with my conversation with Jonathan Demar. I am online with the wonderful Jonathan Demar. I'm in Florida. He's in New York. He just told me he was just in Florida literally yesterday. So the travel
not too far
travel
away.
bug is
I
real.
mean, it was a little further away from you. Otherwise, I would have called. But
Yeah.
thank you for having me. I'm honored to be on the podcast.
So happy to have you here, Jonathan. And what's great is that your podcast is dropping. You're coming a week after Carly, our beloved Carly Fisher, who also was on our team up there in New York,
Having
which we'll
poor
talk about.
connection.
But I know you and Carly have a long history as well.
I'm still
And
here.
we'll get to that too. But I wanted to jump in right away. This is something I just saw in your bio that I didn't know. So I have to ask, you're a singer? Like you just dropped a debut single? What is it, The Right Intimacy? I mean, where'd
Yeah.
this come from? Like, tell me about this angle of Jonathan Demar I knew nothing about.
So I actually started out as a performer in the industry, and it's something, it was really the catalyst for how I got into producing. And one of the things I wanted to always do was keep the performer side of me going. And I was very interested in what other ways I could do that. I don't audition the way I used to because just time-wise, it just never really worked for me to kind of do that balance. But I'd always been very interested in music. I am a big fan of Billy Joel and Michael Bublé and Huey Lewis, and I wanted to combine those styles. And I am not a songwriter by trade, but I'd studied music, and I sought out. I happened to run into a good friend of mine. His name is Tucker, and he has written for various artists. And sometime before the pandemic, we got together at his place in New York and wrote this song. Yeah, I was just kind of encapsulating what I was feeling at the time, and it was something that I thought, well, you know what, we'll put it out when we put it out. We've written a couple of songs since then, but I haven't had the chance to fully go into it. But this one, because I was in the pandemic and there was really nothing for me to do, I thought this is a great opportunity to get the single out. I managed to get a couple of people that I knew to be on the recording. I had my good friends at the record plant mix it and master it with me, and we put it out. I put it out independently in 2020. It was one of the most gratifying creative processes because it was the first time in a while I was doing something for myself and not for someone else.
Oh, yeah,
Because
yeah.
as a producer, you're often servicing the piece. And with this, it was trying to service myself, which was intimidating, and just trying to figure out, am I doing this right? Do I look good? But at the end of the day, I was really, really proud of it. So yeah, it was kind of one of those things like I'm just going to put it out there and see how people respond. And the amount of love that I got from it was overwhelming. And it definitely has made me think that, when I have those opportunities, I'm going to want to write more. So I think more music will be in the works, but that's sort of just my introduction into that world. And it was a really nice, cool pet project to do. So yeah, it's out on Spotify and where you listen to your stuff now.
Oh, fantastic. I will put links in the show notes, everybody, so you can go check out Jonathan in the Right Intimacy. Debut single. Love that's amazing. That I can't wait. I'm gonna go listen to it right after we record.
Oh, cool. I hope you
Um,
enjoy it. I mean, yeah, it must be, I can imagine it's a different experience hearing about that side of me because we've worked in the capacity almost of producer director over the past few
yes.
months. So it is definitely a different
Yes.
side of me, that's for sure.
Yeah, so this is a great segue. So I know I said this in the intro, everybody, but you've all been following along the last several months with Clowns Like Me, our off-Broadway production up at the DR2, and none of it would have happened if we hadn't been connected with Mr. Jonathan Demar. You mentioned Jonathan, so here's the ramp I want to give you here. You mentioned that you started out as a performer. Most people in the theater, you start out as an actor until you figure out what you actually want to be. Like acting is the it's the gateway drug to
Right,
all the
right.
other hardcore drugs of theater.
It's a
Um,
tonic to the soul, yeah, sure.
yeah. Now, if I'm remembering correctly, you grew up in New York? So I just wanna give you a chance to kinda give us your quick nutshell bio backstory of Jonathan growing up and getting into theater in the first place, and eventually, I do wanna get to what the heck is an executive producer, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily know precisely what that looks like. But let's set you up first. How did you get into theater? Where'd you grow up? Then you mentioned having a performer side. What was that like for you before producing got a hold of you?
Well, it's a good question. I was born and raised in New York City, grew up on the Upper East Side. Both my parents are doctors, so not in the business at all. The only connection I ever had to the industry was my late grandfather, who passed away when I was very young, was a publicist for 20th Century Fox, and he was on radio. He had the most commanding voice you've ever heard, and he was very much an inspiration for me because he escaped during World War II in the child cars to come to America. And he made a career for himself. And one of the films that he worked on was Exodus, that starred Paul Newman. And my aunt and mom were actually extras in that film. So that was kind of their taste of theater. So I think my parents sort of understood it, but in a different way. I always had a passion where I loved watching performance or singing. I remember just watching commercial jingles and being like, well, that's cool. Or I'd see people perform on TV and be like, that's awesome. I kind of want to do that. And there was a moment. So for a bit there, I lived in Westchester for about 8 years of my life. My family decided to move to Westchester for me, actually, because there was the right school for me at the time. And in second grade, we had this project where we would sing we would come up with some jingle, I guess, for something. I forgot exactly what the premise of the project was, but I used the Folgers commercial song and I made up lyrics to it. And my teacher was like, "You should be a singer." And I was like, "Oh, wow, that's crazy." And my parents, they really believed in me. My mom, we found a voice teacher in Westchester. Her name was Jennifer, and she taught me a lot about singing, stuff that I didn't know. I mean, I remember I had a voice lesson where I didn't really believe that people actually breathed at all, and that was like a full lesson on that. It's all crazy stuff. But yeah,
Right.
I grew up like in Westchester, like studying, and I was in a choir, like a Christmas Carol choir singing group, and it was really incredible experience, and it made me get in touch with performing. And there was kind of this interesting pivotal moment where I had found out, I think my mom knew someone that recommended I try out for the New York City Opera Children's Chorus. And I went into audition and I got into kind of like the introductory chorus where you learned a lot of the stuff, but you weren't eligible for the productions. And I learned the all the parts to La Boheme that the kids would sing. And I really liked it. And there's something that attracted me in that. And then the next year I went to the kids chorus where you would be auditioning. And coincidentally, while all that was happening, so I went to Ardsley for elementary school, and my mom met this mother, and she was explaining that I would need to get out early to go to New York City to go, be in this children's chorus. And this mother was like, "Oh, I understand completely what you're talking about." And her son is Justin McCartney. And she said, "Well, there's this group that you could audition for called the Sugar Beats." And she recommended me for it. I sang for it. And then I literally started recording that day. It was for the Christmas,
Wow.
and it was just insane, and I got to work with all these people that had been on Broadway. It was just wild. They all had Broadway credits, and I was just really starting out, and so it was an amazing experience. I went to professional children's school, like, a couple months following that, and pursued getting a manager and an agent, went to all the Broadway auditions, was in contention for a lot of those roles that as a child actor, I would have to be that would have a boy soprano part. So that was a really interesting experience in understanding how to audition in circumstances of professional caliber. And I had a voice teacher, I had an acting teacher, I had a dance teacher. And the first show I did in New York was a Gilbert and Sullivan Christmas Carol, which I actually auditioned for out of a notice that was sent to my school. They were looking for a Tiny Tim, and I won the role. That was one of my first experiences. And then I auditioned for various things. I was in the running for Baz Luhrmann's La Boheme, which I actually was supposed to do. And I ended up getting this show called A Christmas Carol, which had been playing seasonally at Madison Square Garden. And it was their kind of annual Broadway show. And so that was my Broadway debut. And I just remember with both of those experiences, like how rigorous the auditions were, but also like the fact that how many times I went in for it, remembering like the final callback, like the feeling, the nostalgia of that. And so fast forward many years later, and I had been performing, TV, film, theater in various capacities, and my voice was changing. And
I
you know,
was
that
gonna say, you
happens.
mentioned boy soprano. It's hard to imagine that. I've only ever heard your rich, baritone this whole time.
Well, that's the funny thing because, yeah, my voice definitely dropped, and it's a whole discovery, and I was hoping to be that
Yeah.
voice forever, and that didn't quite, match up.
No.
So, I really had to and my parents were very much like, "You should get an education." I did wanna continue auditioning. I really had a passion for it. But to be honest with you, in high school, I really wasn't getting anything. I wasn't getting traction. And I thought to myself, maybe this is a good time to start thinking about maybe even if it's like for 4 years, it'll put me on the right track in some way. But during all that experience, Jason, I was always attracted to the behind the scenes aspect of theater because once you're immersed with it as an actor, you want to know how everything works. And it's really, I found myself to be a very curious kid. Like I would
Yeah.
ask very interesting questions about how things worked and how the process was. And I knew business was something I would want to do in any case. As I was kind of looking at where to go to for college, I was looking at, well, who could I emulate that does a little bit of everything? And I was like inspired by Ryan Seacrest because he has so many companies that he runs, but he's also a host capacity. And I always thought, well, maybe I'll fit that mold, but for theater. But I didn't really think that kind of existed. But coincidentally, I went to school in his hometown. I went to Emory University for what ended up being a journalism and music composition degree. I studied a bit of business. I came back to New York after graduating and I was like, well, what now? Because what I had done over the summer is I had continued just training because I just never knew, I'd wanted to get back into it, but I would work hard during the year during school. And I came to realize while I try to audition, I might as well try to figure out what a producer is because I always had an interest in it. I had produced an internet radio show while I was in college that was in New York. So I was very much curious about the behind the scenes, connecting with people, like the ins and outs of it. And I had the fortune of meeting a producer by the name of Van Deen, who we had been in touch for years. But when I officially came back to New York, I bumped into him at a party of a good friend of mine, David Zippel. And David and I had met about a month ago through a family friend, and I asked him for candidate advice. And he's like, well, while you audition, why don't you ask, can you be an associate producer? Which typically what he meant was like work for someone or work under someone to kind of learn and gain experience. And for me, it was valuable because it gave me a purpose of what to ask for. It gave me a directive. And so I met all these people. I was talking about theater, and I think Van Deen saw something in me where he was like, yeah, let's meet. That meeting never happened. He had something come up. He had a big meeting and he called me and he said, I'm sorry we never got to get in touch. And I'll explain to you why. I've been asked to general partner a show that's coming to Broadway and you should look at it because I'll bring you on as a co-producer. And I thought, well,
Whoa.
that's new to me. And it was this play called The Velocity of Autumn. And it starred Estelle Parsons and Stephen Spinella. It had
Wow.
been in DC at Arena Stage and I got great reviews. I had known Estelle Parsons. I'd seen her do Nice Work If You Can Get It. I believe she was in the original cast of that show. And I always regarded her as like a legend of the theater. And I thought, well, this is kind of the great moment for her. And maybe she will win a Tony for this because she had won an Oscar already. I think she was an Oscar nominee. No, she was an Oscar winner. My God, it's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
She won for Bonnie and Clyde. But I said yes to it. It was like a small raise of $75,000, but it was one of the hardest raises I have ever done in my life because I had no idea how to do it. And I just asked around. And Jason, when I tell you I asked around and really started to learn like what are the regulations when you ask for money,
Ah,
who are the right people to ask for money from. But it also allowed me to connect with people I hadn't connected with that started getting into the business or had some connection within the business where I was given advice and counsel. And so I learned a lot from that. I ended up doing love letters as an associate producer, literally that next fall. And I just sort of kept going and trying to find opportunity for myself and working like odd gigs and such. And to me, that was really the start. But what I fell in love with, Jason, was meeting all sorts of people and thinking,
yeah.
this opens up a door for me to meet all kinds of people. And I wasn't even thinking for my performance career, although certainly that was in mind, but it was all for the fact that I just want to work with good people. And I
Yeah.
didn't realize how valuable that was until the terms of when I came in contact with people that maybe weren't as good for me, that I fully realized, oh, yeah, I actually want to work with good people. I want to work with people that are going to help me not just succeed, but be nourished because it is
Yeah.
a career that you are building. And I always look at that every single year. What's the next thing I want to do? What's the next goal post? And so I think beginning on that journey was so important. And then obviously up till now to have had all the experiences I've had and all the shows I've been involved with. And I sit here very, very grateful. And I'm grateful that my acting side allowed me, has been a part of me in terms of how I produce and how I approach producing.
Great. Yeah. I'm going to stick a pin in that because I actually had that as a question I want to ask later. But great. So that now we're to the point where we can dig in. But first, a few clarifications. Is that Folgers commercial the one that goes, the best part of waking up is Folgers in your cup? Do
Yes,
you remember what lyrics you wrote for that
I
little
don't. I
ditty?
don't.
No. Oh,
Yeah. I wish I did. I wonder if
that
Miss
could be your second single. It could have been your second single.
Oh my god. No. Yeah. I mean, that would be interesting, wouldn't it now, reflecting back on it? I think Miss Friedman would know that, so
Right.
and
Totally right.
she gets some credit for that, so because she encouraged me to keep going even to this day. But yeah, that would be interesting. Boy, I mean, it's has anybody done a commercial jingle as a single now? Made something?
Be a
I feel
Folgers
like
remix. I don't know. The Demar remix.
hey, there you go. Exactly, exactly.
All right, so this is something I've noticed about you as well, and even before you started listing off here. So you've met like Estelle, Van, Tucker, David. One of your superpowers is that you know everybody. Like I noticed this in Patrick Page. I know him. Let me give him a call. Right. Even so, an author I published, Dan Landon, who was a
Oh my
Broadway
god.
manager for many years. All of a sudden, I mentioned, "Oh, I'm doing this thing in New York with Jonathan Demar." And Dan's like, "I know Jonathan," and I'm like, Come on, what?" It's like so everyone I've ever met in New York is like, "Oh yeah, Jonathan Demar. I got him on speed dial."
Well, let
So
me
it's
put
the
it
way you
let me say, because I think this is really important, Dan Landon knows everybody, and you could always find him at a bar pretty easily, when he was a theater manager because he was enveloped in the community. I mean, my Dan Landon story is I happened to be at this place, Glass House Tavern in New York, and I'm sitting next to him and we're having a conversation. And he tells me I'm a theater manager. I told him that I'm a producer and a performer. And he was like, oh, I have a musical for you. And I was like, oh, you've never heard me sing before. He said, no, I have a musical for you. And I thought he was joking with me. He called me and he was like, so you want to do this? And I'm like, yeah, I want to do it. And it was a musical called Dream On. It was the most silly thing, but it was just absolutely hilarious. And it was about this kid who just became a Broadway producer, and I was like, he just knew me off the bat for some reason. He got my energy, and I did that reading. God, Katrina Yorke was playing opposite me. It was a fantastic actress and singer. It was all these people, though, that he knew from Phantom of the Opera. So it was like
Ah.
almost every supporting person who was ever in Phantom of the Opera or vice versa who was in this reading. And I was just sitting there. We're all just cracking each other up. There were people that he worked with at the theater bar that were there. One of them is now a dresser on Hadestown that I've become very good friends with. One of them's a writer that I had worked with for a bit. I mean, it's one of those things where, like, you talk about someone who brings people together. I mean, Dan Landon really is like, he just finds people and does stuff. And I mean, his book is amazing. Congratulations on publishing that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Now, I know that you just, yeah, you were so kind to go to his launch event at the Drama Bookstore up there, Drama Bookshop a couple weeks ago. And he's still kind of doing his book launch through New York, New Jersey. We're going to do an event for him down here in August too. But yeah, just he dropped about every name you can drop in his book. But then when he met you and I started talking to you, I'm like, oh, Jonathan could probably keep up. Everybody knows you and loves you. It's amazing. But I
Oh
think
my
that goes to
God.
what you were just saying, Jonathan, about your desire that part of what makes you tick is meeting and working with good people. And that becomes a pay it forward type thing, right? So
Mhm.
this leads me to my next question, which is in terms of what producing is, because you've mentioned associate producer, you've mentioned co-producer. Now on our show, you were executive producer. You just used the term I had to do a raise, right? And I'm guessing for the most part, you work in commercial for-profit theater. So when you say you had to do a raise, does that mean is a producer an investor? Does a producer bring together investors? I think a lot of people don't quite get the delineations between executive, co,
Yeah,
associate,
sure.
raise. So if you could just kind of parse some of that like insider talk for us, that would be awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are a lot of sort of discrepancies, but producer in general, the way I describe it on a very general level is they help make things happen. Whether you are a co-producer where your role is to raise or cause money to be raised or put in money yourself. Associate producer sometimes is a raise, or it can be working under a producer and helping that office. And, in the case of our relationship, an executive producer is like a coach, is a cheerleader, someone that comes on that's had the experience of doing something in similar fashion. And they're there to help the lead producer take what their vision is and run with it and be sort of an advising figure. So you mentioned Clowns Like Me, which I'm the executive producer on for the New York run. I was approached by a good friend of mine in Tom Curtihe's office, actually, and he was like, I met with these guys. It's a really touching story. Tom can't do anything with it, but they really are looking for a creative producer. And usually, when that comes in conversation, it's often a conversation about being an executive producer because they're just looking for someone. They're not looking necessarily for a financial commitment, but they're looking for someone that can help them get from point A to point B and plan it. So my role with Clowns was really to take what was done in Sarasota and say, what theater, what timeline's going to work, really working with the lead producer, giving advice along the way, helping decide who they want to hire for marketing, to be the GM, to be in press, and really have the hands-on approach. Because it's a lot of times executive producers are brought on for people that may not have had they may have had experience in other fields in business, but have not done theater. And so having that person there that can guide them. But also, I think the thing about executive producer, unlike a lead producer, which is who is really in charge of putting everything together, is that an executive producer knows when they need to take a step back and let the lead producer do what they feel is right, and then give that give that advice when they feel it's merited and necessary, and try to be helpful in the process.
Yeah. Sometimes I feel like a lot of those titles don't really mean a whole lot unless you're inside that particular production. But I like what you're saying. There's a sense of almost like in terms of this relationship, because Lifeline Productions, Joel, our good friend Joel Aaron Price, he was lead producer on this, right? And he'd already produced the show in Sarasota. So in a way, your job as executive producer was almost like in a lot of way you were a translator, you were a guide, you were greasing the skids, because none of us with Clowns Like Me had any idea how the New York stuff operated, right? You mentioned
Right.
at one point like regulations about money, even like tax code, hiring codes, and we were doing this nonprofit model too. So all of those things had so many bells and whistles and red tapes and needles to thread and having like your eye, Carly's eye, people who've lived it up in New York just to help kind of what you don't want to turn left there. You'll run
Yeah.
into a wall. But if you go straight, then turn a right, then turn a left at, that'll get you where you want to go.
Right, exactly. And if anything else, really my job is to just ensure that the person bringing me on has the infrastructure in place to do what they need to do. It's important to have a solid general manager that one can trust. And Carly, who I've worked with before, is amazing. And I brought this to her and she immediately said yes. And so it's been fun to have her on board because she provides, from the financial perspective, that's a conversation that can always be having. and she's been through that. So it's good to have that person. It's good to have that team generally. And I think one of the rewarding things about being an executive producer is that you can really dig into the weeds with someone, especially if you're excited about something. I think the way Clowns Like Me is such an important cause. And when I got the material, I knew that for myself, it would be a nice thing for me to do because I felt very connected to Scott in the material. And it's
Yeah.
just about like, how can I service these people? It's a being of service to the piece. And I
Yeah.
think that really is no matter what your capacity is at the end of the day.
Jonathan, during Clowns Like Me, at a certain point as we were doing runs and previews, you and I started talking to the side. This is the kind of director I am. I'm a director whose philosophy is best idea wins wherever it comes from, right? I just
Mhm.
want to throw everything at the wall, see what sticks. Even when the show is kind of set and we're in that place of previews and getting audience response, even audience response is just it's data points that has to be interpreted,
Right,
right?
which
It's
which I
not
really
it's
liked
never
about you, Jason, because we didn't have a chance to really work together, and what was nice about New York in the preview process is you were very open, and some directors sometimes are not, and that was
yeah.
very refreshing to, like, be able to have a conversation with you after the show, in a casual way and say, "Well, what can we do in this spot?" Because I think it was all what was rewarding, I think, especially in our relationship, was the show actually got better over time. And although
Yep.
you attended in Sarasota and, there was a pace for it, I think the thing we always were conscientious about is that New York audiences are so different. And it
Very
was
different.
good,
Yeah.
it was a good translation, I think, going from first preview to opening and just seeing also how Scott grew during that time as
Yeah.
well.
Oh, yeah. Man, I'm so proud of that guy. Jeez.
It's
Yeah, that was
remarkable.
something that
I don't think I could pull off what he's doing. It's just a remarkable performance, and yeah, I mean, to be that vulnerable for 75 minutes every night, it's a tall order, but he really matches it.
yes, yes, and then also that to come back to the talk back and be as articulate and charming and vulnerable as he is there too, just, oh, love that guy. Yeah, so I had the same experience, Jonathan, just I've often experienced, from all kinds of angles, people coming in with agendas or, when there's an artistic moment and people just, like, dig in their heels, it can get really ugly and it can end up hurting the performers and just I early in my career, I saw that happen way too many times, and I swore to myself as a director, that's not the room I ever wanna run,
Mhm.
right? I mean, I think if you talk to Sean and Zhang Fu and everyone else, all of our designers on the show too, it was a constant give and take, like, "I'm the director, I know the buck stops with me, but you're way better at lighting design than I am. You're way better at you understand New York audiences way more than I do. I would be abdicating my artistic responsibility if I didn't take in the input from those who know things better than I do. It's always been my
Well, it's also a
philosophy.
collaboration, right? Because
Yes.
it's not even the New York part of it, but it's like just having collaborators that understand your vision and are gonna not just make it what your vision is, but even exceed it. You want
Yes.
people that push you. I think that's a beautiful thing because it makes you better at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is something for you, Jonathan, you have to navigate, especially because you have that actor, singer, performer experience, not just an eye, not just as an observer or audience member. I mean, there is something about seeing as much theater as you see, for sure. But at the same time, you've been inside it. So show to show, it probably depends on your relationships, depends on what level of producer you are, depends on is it a little off-Broadway show where we really look to you for guidance or whether it's like highest level Broadway where there's a ton of brilliant people in the room. As a producer, what do you see as your responsibility in terms of the art or the storytelling? Do you ask permission to give notes? Are you expected to give notes? Does it vary show to show? I just love to kind of hear how you personally navigate that where it can get sticky, where it's literally the artistic choices being made. How much influence do you have? Do you want to have? Should you have?
I think it's a very good question. The way I operate is that I let the artists be the artists. There's an understanding of what the concept is from the get-go. We discuss that. And then I tell my people, go do what you need to do. I mean, I'll monitor it. I'll certainly give my input, but I'm not going to be someone that's like giving notes every single day. I think it's a detriment for the artist. I think where I can be helpful is that once the show has a run through and rehearsal, and I can pinpoint a couple of things, or even during tech rehearsal where I could be helpful and sort of guiding our team to where I think the show should be, that's where I think I can be influential. My job essentially is to help make sure that the show is marketed. Well, first of all, that the show is put together, that all the team members come together, and then to make sure that the show is marketed in the best way possible to ensure that we have everybody that will take it to that next level, and to be in charge of how the show is perceived and to ensure that tickets are being sold. 'Cause that's really the job of a lead producer. But I think for me, it's just very much in any capacity, just looking at a show when it's up and giving my thoughts and candor on it and really asking specific questions about motivation, things that I think could help lean things in a direction. Because I find when you ask a question, that leads to an answer and understanding an answer. And then you can ask a follow-up question if you're not getting to where you need to go. Instead of saying, Jason, like, I think this moment needs more light. You could say, within this scene, what is the meaning behind the light choices at the moment? Like,
Yeah.
what is the intent of that? And then if, let's say, it's well, because I don't want to blind, people on stage. I want to make it mellow. And I could say, well, I'm wondering, do we want to amp it up just a little bit so that there is a bit more energy into it? And then that can lead to a productive discussion about what needs to happen.
Yeah, because then you bring the line designer in, and it's not even just necessarily like even a simple example like that. It's not just brighter, it's adding energy to the space, and that could be light on the actor, it could be light on the backdrop, it could
Yeah.
be it could be a brighter color of light, like a yellow or orange instead of a purple. There's all kinds of ways to, I love what you just said, add energy, but you only get to that kind of specificity by asking the question.
Let's say there was a direction where the actor didn't face a certain way and it didn't convey what we wanted. The question I could ask the director is, instead of saying, well, she should be facing upward to make that happen, I should say, what was the intention behind this moment? And they could say, well, I actually had wanted this, but they took that direction to be somewhat different. And I said, is there any way you could convey that to them? Because I think that would give more specificity to the moment. And then we could have a resolved situation, or we can have a continued discussion about it. Or like, how is the other actor thinking about it? Because I guess more my philosophy is that the more questions you ask, the better answers you're going to get.
Yes. Yeah, it reminds me of, I think it's from Toyota. Their model for finding the truth is to ask why 5 times. Like, so there's a problem. Why? Answer 1. Why? And that literally you don't get to finish. You don't even get to offer like a first answer until you've asked why 5 times, like
Right.
drilling deep.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah. It's fascinating.
Great. So another thing I think for our listeners, and they heard this in the bio, but I'm going to say again. So you've won a few Tonys as a producer on Hadestown, and just a couple months ago, Stereophonic, Merrily We Roll Along, appropriate. Okay, so two-part question. First, how do you get on to so many shows like that? How do you not like lose your mind? How do you keep it all straight? And second, what's it like to win a Tony? Like, what is that experience? Like to be in the room, to be on the stage, the party, like there's got to be something both fulfilling and surreal about something
Well,
like that.
this season has just been absolutely incredible. And if you asked me around this time if I was going to be on so many shows that would be award-winning shows, I'd be like, I have no idea. Crazy to think that, because it just sort of worked out in a very like organic way where kind of each show I had an opportunity with. I've been involved with Merrily since last year. So that one was already kind of done in a sense. But, appropriate and stereophonic, every show I co-produce, I tend to know who the lead producer is or I have a connection within it. But I also love the material and I feel a connection to the material. And then I feel like, well, the numbers work. I have been fortunate that I gain a group of investors that have come to work with me on sometimes multiple shows. Sometimes I'll do one show a season. Sometimes I'll do two. And I was fortunate enough that with these projects, I was able to find people just as passionate enough about me and be able to invite them to come along on the journey. And they're coming for their own reasons. I think they want to support theater or they feel an attachment to a project in some way. And so this particular timing was actually good because it was kind of spread out. It seems like it's all happening at once, but the reality is that these raises happen at different times during the process. Like Stereophonic, I got the call officially like the beginning of this year that things were happening and got the packet and sent it out. And following that raise for that, I got a call that Appropriate was looking to move and asked if I had interest. And I voiced it and I went to people and got that together. So it was very sporadic how all these things happen, but in no way, shape, or form did it all happen all at once.
Right.
Contrary to might be popular belief. So I'm very lucky that the people I've been able to work with just happen to have really good projects, but it is about relationships.
Yes.
Going to the Tony Awards, I mean, there's no greater feeling than to be at the biggest party for theater and to get the award and to be part of the madness of it all. It's absolutely thrilling. I pinch myself every time because if you had told me 10 years ago that I would win 3 Tony Awards as a co-producer in one night, I would think you would be absolutely nuts. But because of how all these things lined up and, again, it goes back to having taste, and I do feel fortunate that I don't often say yes to everything. And I say yes to things for their own reasons, but those shows really were impacted me in many different ways where I felt I want to be a part of these things. And, for me, the Tony Awards is a culmination of the hard work that we do to just get these shows up because, yeah, it can get crazy when you have a couple of shows running at once. You're sending communication to your investors, you're getting updates, you're always networking as these shows are running. So there's a lot going on and there's a lot to keep tabs of, but I just felt so lucky to be associated with any of these productions and with their teams and get to know the company and people that make it happen. It's really fulfilling that when a show opens on Broadway and you get to see it opening night and you're like, oh my God, just thrilling to be a cheerleader in a wild way. And that's kind of what the job is essentially. You are a cheerleader for everybody involved. And, it's part business, part cheerleader, part therapist. So for that opportunity of like winning an award for it, it's just the icing on the cake.
Yeah.
I don't really think about the award as the end all be all. I think about the work being kind of the end all be all for me. The award is just a nice thing to have. And, I'm very fortunate. The Tony night was incredible and very, 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 very lucky. And it allows me opportunities for people to come to me that want to be a part of this, but also for me to explore what the next frontier is for me as a producer. I'm already developing projects and I'm excited about that frontier because I think
Yeah.
lead producing is something I want to do more long term. And so to have the co-producing career that I've had has been fruitful. And for that to happen last month, it just was a culmination of a lot of hard work. And I'm very, very grateful.
Yeah. Well, congratulations for sure. Yeah, we noticed you didn't come in that next day
Yeah,
after the Tony. I think the party was well earned.
it was a late night. Yeah, and I knew you all were in tech, so I was like, "I'm gonna let them work," and then
Yeah,
I
I'm just
I
gonna
I did
take the
come in
cake.
on that Tuesday, and,
You did.
y'all were very
Absolutely did.
sweet. It was a very moving moment, but yeah, no, I figured you had it down. I mean, our tech process was pretty simple, but I
So
wanted to
smooth.
make sure you all felt comfortable, but because you all had done the show before, I think you ended up actually going way ahead of schedule, which is
Yes.
great.
So you talked about culmination, you talked about feeling so lucky. And earlier talking about your single, about the pandemic. You were in New York through that. And I remember so specifically,
It
I
was.
literally the day our theater, Florida Studio Theater, had to shut down when I was still staff there. I had just been in a tech rehearsal literally that morning.
Oh my god.
And there was a company meeting called. And it was a thing where I was like, I was enough in the know that I was like, we have to keep up appearances for right now. So I'm gonna put in a few hours of tech this morning, but then we have this company meeting. I'm pretty sure what's coming. And sure enough, that everything there was a show in tech, there was 3 shows running, and all of a sudden, like a done, all of it off. And we had people we had to find. Some of them couldn't fly home. Some of the, and it was just this sudden and everyone experienced this, right? For me, that was my experience. Literally from a tech rehearsal that morning to everything is shut down. Take your stuff home. We'll see you when we see you.
Right.
I can't even imagine what it must have been like in New York. That many people, so little space, and for that kind of a industry to shut down in a moment's notice. What I want to ask you, Jonathan, is now that we're a few years past that, and Broadway's kind of roaring back a bit. I'm curious, as someone who's living in it every day, what do you see as the state of American theater? And not even necessarily just Broadway, but American theater as a whole. Like, you've got your finger on the pulse up there. Like, what do you think the trajectory is? What's the new normal? I don't think we've gone back to exactly the way it was. That we had to adapt a bit. But what do you see as the biggest obstacles coming up, and what do you see as kind of the biggest, wow, we are on a great path moving forward? What do you think is happening?
So I think it has changed the way we look at theater because if you remember, pre-pandemic, we had people coming from all over the world to Broadway. And I think that part is actually starting to come back. We reopened Broadway in 2021, in the fall of 2021. And that was a very scary time. Nobody knew what was happening. And if you looked at 2019, 2020, we had some really, really good numbers on Broadway. And I feel like right now we're getting close to pre-pandemic levels. We're definitely getting there. I would say this last season was the first time that I felt Broadway was really coming back in a sense that you had record grosses. Ticket prices are going up a little bit. Our expenses are going up because of COVID. So I don't know if that's an amazing thing, but I am noticing that people are gravitating going towards theater and younger people are. There is a
Mm,
generational shift happening right now. If you look at what Enemy of the People, which I was a part of as a co-producer, that brought a lot of young people to the theater, not just because of Jeremy Strong, but because of that story. Stereophonic is getting a lot of young people to the theater. We're seeing a really great generational shift happening over there. It's happening all across Broadway, and it's happening off Broadway too. And I think there is a testament to say that those of us who were in our teens that loved Broadway, that our parents took us, we are now the ticket buyers. We are paying for
right.
those seats. And some of those people are paying for the premium seats. So we're starting to become the ticket buyer on Broadway, which means that we are getting to decide what we like. And I feel as if Broadway has changed a lot for the better. I think we had to have 2021 and 22 as a grounding to kind of realize where we are at, where our center was. And I feel the more and more we get through these kind of weeks, we're seeing some really good art happen and just the enthusiasm. Now, the age has gone down in terms of who's seeing it. I can say because of the pandemic, not as many older people are coming to the theater. There are still older people going.
Yeah.
That is never going to change, but not as many as it used to be. So the real purchasing power is in that kind of 30 to 50-year-old bracket. And that's really fascinating. And that's something I have found interesting. The other thing that is interesting is because of the pandemic, there is a lot more content than there ever has been. This past
Mm,
Broadway season We had an opening almost every night in the spring. It was quite ridiculous, and I hope it doesn't ever happen again. I think this next season might be the last season where we're a little bit overcrowded, and that's gonna calm down, but it's because a lot of things weren't able to come in because of the pandemic and everything was backed up. I think we are in a better place, but I think there is more work to do in terms of diversity. I think equity is a big thing, and we're still
Yeah.
pushing through that. But I do think the tales of a Broadway that were problematic, that's starting to shift a little bit. But I do think we do have to combat labor costs, ticket prices, theater owners, that's a big part of it. And we love our theater owners, but theaters are expensive. So we
Yeah.
have to combat all of the things. And, what is the priority of the producer? What's the priority of the artist? What's the priority of the theater owner? And they're very different. And I feel like we just need to figure out how they can somehow coalesce in a way that will make art and make it continue to thrive. But I do believe in the Broadway industry now more than ever. And I'm so proud to be a part of it, is particularly last season, because I think there was some really good stuff out there. And you can't ask for better audiences than Broadway audiences. I also do think that if you look at what's going on with Jersey crowds, they're starting to come back. The suburban crowds, not as much as they used to, but they are starting to come back. It's going to be a trickle, but I think we're going to get there, and I feel quite optimistic about it. But I also think the other thing to point out is that people are now going to be very picky about what they go see if they're coming from.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you have that young audience, mind you, but you also do have people that they normally will go see 5 Broadway shows. They're going to go see maybe 2. So you better be that show that appeals to someone, or at the very least, you better have your costs in order so that you can survive on Broadway. So it is tricky. And so I'm saying this while still feeling very optimistic about where our industry is going, because we have succeeded. I always say, if you have good content, people will come. And I do think that still holds true.
Jonathan, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. I wish I had gotten more of this before I'd been to New York with you.
I know
Um,
we've been both so busy, but no, this has been such a
yeah.
pleasure, Jason.
So I always like to wrap up with a couple pieces of advice and a spotlight. So this first question is, what is the best advice that you have ever taken?
Oof, it's so interesting. The best advice I've ever taken, really be conscious of the people you surround yourself with.
Yeah.
That is advice I've taken, and that's advice I give. Be very conscious of the people you surround yourself with, because they're going to make you do better and be there when you need it. They're going to support you. And it's not really a loyalty thing so much as it's a connectivity thing, where if you have good artists working with you that are on the same page and you like each other, makes it easier to work. And I'm not advocating that you always have to work with your friends. I've been very lucky to call the collaborators I work with friends. But I will say that you do develop friendships from the work you do because you care about each other. So
Yeah.
really aligning and surrounding yourself with good people is the best advice I've ever been given.
Great. It's almost that's a kind of a version of the old one of if you're in a room and you're the smartest one in it, you're in the wrong room.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if you're the best in a dance class, take another dance class.
Exactly. Yep. Yep. Level up.
Yeah. Yeah, level up.
Um, so flip side, what is the worst advice that you have ever given?
That I've ever given or have been given?
That you've ever given?
Oof. See, this is a harder one, but I think
Yeah.
I can say, be almost too protective of yourself.
Hmm.
And what I think I meant by that at the time is be conscious of what you share. I think in this age, it's so different because it is a collaboration. I find that the more I'm open with someone, the more someone is going to be open with me. I think it's hard I never tell people to be closed off, but I tell people to always be careful. The
Mm,
best advice I can say is be pragmatic, but don't be cynical.
yeah.
And I think cynicism is the worst quality. And I grew up with mentors that were so cynical. It was like really just, it made me feel like I can't accomplish anything. Although, ironically, one of my more cynical mentors congratulated me on Hadestown. And I thought it was cool for me. But, like, I don't again, it goes back to surrounding yourself with people. But I think I probably told people, maybe be a little cynical and just for your own health, but I don't think that's good advice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's that I totally hear what you're saying, especially like in this world of social media saturation. It's really easy to overshare way too much, way too fast. And I
Mhm.
think that's the danger I think you were trying to help someone avoid is it's less even about cynicism now and more just about that once it's out there, you can't get it back. So trust has to be earned over time as opposed to just everyone's immediately your best friend.
Yeah, exactly. And I
Yeah.
could not have said it better.
Hey-o. No. Hey, Jonathan, so now this is the time, a spotlight for you. So if people want to get to know you better, where can they find you? Are you like on the
At
socials? Do you have shows coming up, a website? Where can they go learn more about Jonathan
I
Demar?
am at Jonathan Demar on Instagram. That's the best place, or you could go to jonathandemar.com and you can sign up for my email list. And yeah, that's where you can find me at Jonathan Demar or jonathandemar.com.
Fantastic. Yeah, hop on that list. I'm on that list. You get the news, you get the updates, you kind of see what shows are coming up. Fantastic. Can you give us, are you allowed? Can you give us like, is there a show coming up we absolutely must check out if we're up in New York?
I have a couple of things in the works. Can't say anything yet, but I'm
No.
really, really excited to. I'm excited to talk about it when it's the right time. But really, really thrilled about the stuff I'm developing right now. That's been really fulfilling.
Awesome. Jonathan, thank you so much for your time today and sharing all this. Just really, really appreciate it. And on another note, too, thank you for your work on Clowns Like Me and helping us get that up there and taking such good care of Scotty and the team. I am forever grateful.
Oh my God, no, thank you, Jason. And it's been lovely working with you on that show. And thank you for inviting me on here. It's been wonderful.
The Page and Stage podcast is built with Alitu, the all-in-one podcasting app created by the amazing team over at thepodcasthost.com. You can learn more about all my guests and access their websites and projects in the episode summaries. If you enjoyed and found value in this podcast, please tell at least one other person. Word of mouth has always been and will always be the best marketing tool in the world. Thank you for listening, and until next time, I'm Jason Cannon, and I cannot wait to hear your story.